Welcome to the Divine Counsel Worldview Podcast. In this episode, we are going to go back to the text. We're going to go to Genesis 31 and finish chapter 32 as well. And last time we talked about this two powers in heaven controversy that was part of Mishnah and the Talmudic tradition of the early rabbis, and got pretty technical, but we had fun with it. Is there anything else we want to summarize, Mike, before we jump into one of the stories that does have a second power, as it were, or at least, some kind of being that is understood to be God in some traditions. So anything that we, in your opinion, we should finalize or that we want to clarify before we head on into our next conversation?
So like in the last episode, I remember we ended when you shared your opinion that you didn't think Jesus was the second, was Yahweh. But I think we need to clarify because, so I'll say for where I stand, right? I do think Jesus is the second Yahweh, but I'll qualify that with the acknowledgement. In my mind, when I hear the name Yahweh, I am equating that synonymously with the concept of creator, right? Of the creator God.
Is that also the Father in the New Testament?
Yes.
When Jesus says the Father, is he saying Yahweh? In your opinion?
He's not saying Yahweh. He's saying the Father. and I was trying is this a trick question?
No. I'll tell you what I'm going to trick you. Don't worry about that.
Oh boy. It's just that in my mind that's how conceptually I acknowledge in my mind the name Yahweh is synonymous with the concept of creator now. And so when I read a scholar talking about the two powers or the two Yahwehs, that's what I'm kind of bringing into mind is the creatorship portion.
Oh, okay.
Right. And actually in Will Hite and Wynn's book, that was part of the criteria that they had in what qualifies as a second power? That to be equal to power as Yahweh, to the first power. And so I think it was two of the things that they bring up was the concept of, are they worshipped? Is the being worshipped? Is the being involved with creation? Is the being attributed to creation? Like the act of creation. And so that was where they were kind of bringing up all this criteria regarding of what counts as a second power? Oh, here it is. I have it. Receiving worship, creating the cosmos, ruling over creation, bearing the name, taking the role of Yahweh, and also holding additional titles. It's almost as though it's like a sovereign king. I remember years ago watching The Crown, and they're naming off all the titles that Queen Elizabeth had. She's not just only the monarch of England, but that she's the queen of this and the regent of this and this and this and this, that there's so many additional titles to attribute to this being. And so that was kind of their criteria breakdown as they were going through their work.
Yeah, and that criteria is interesting. Having not read the book, there's discussion. This goes back to Larry Hurtado's work at Edinburgh and such, that what constitutes worship. How was Jesus handled in the first century? Was he worshipped? And he argued that he was. But his criteria, and I'm running from memory here, was things like songs sung to him, prayers made to him, and they'd pray to him, not just getting down and worshiping, because his point is that, and this is generally understood, I thought this was common knowledge, and maybe I'd have to read Will Hite more carefully, that the concept of worship or prostrating oneself was not considered, anything more than showing obeisance to the role the person was playing. So that if the Rabshakeh is it Jeremiah? Or where is he? Is that Ezekiel? The Rabshakeh shows up and does, tells the people, I think it's Jeremiah. He tells the people, here is what the king of Babylon is saying, comma, quotation mark, and then he starts talking. If you didn't listen to Rabshakeh, you were being understood to being in rebellion against the king. In other words, his words were the king's words, that kind of stuff. So that worship or obeisance in Hurtado's mind was not really able to be tracked when it came to actually bowing down to someone, because they bowed down to David too. So anyway, that's good stuff. And shall we just say we're on to a huge topic that's going to take the rest of our lives, and enjoyably so. This is what being a Christian is, I think, is intellectually asking, how did we get from Genesis 1 to Revelation 4 or 5, and what's the path to ascension and glorification that not just Jesus has, but we share with him by the time Revelation itself is done. We've got a fascinating end to that story too. So much going on. But anyway, that discussion lays out our options for today's discussion. We're going to talk about Jacob wrestling in Genesis 32. To get us going, let's go to Genesis 31, though, and let me just give you some background, give us some background to where we can pick up in Genesis chapter 31. Jacob has been living with Leah and Rachel's family. That's up in Padam Aram, or Haran. He has grown wealthy living with Laban, his father-in-law. His relationship to Laban is tense and getting tenser. And so that was the end of 30. Jacob's Elohim is Yahweh. And this is an interesting storyline, again, because of where we have our antenna up. But when it comes to who is Abraham's Elohim, we know that's Yahweh. Maybe not. Does he have a name for him yet? Again, the debate about, is Yahweh a term that was revealed at this point in world history? But Isaac's Elohim is Yahweh, clearly. And again, that's just going back in our story. Jacob's Elohim is Yahweh, though, let's go back to 28, verse 20. He makes this statement. Then Jacob made a vow saying, if Elohim be with me and keep me in this way. He's heading up to Haran. And give me bread to eat and clothing to put on so that I come back to my father's house in peace. Then Yahweh shall be my Elohim. Those are scary words. Now, again, I appreciate his honesty, but unlike Abraham and Isaac, his father and grandfather, he said, all right, Elohim, Yahweh, Elohim, if you want to be mine and I'm going to take you as mine, you're going to have to perform for me. That's basically how it says. If you do this, this, and this, even give me clothing to put on, then Yahweh shall be my God. So there is, this sounds just like Jacob, and I appreciate the Bible's honesty and clarity in providing a personality to Jacob, even within this text, that makes us say, boy, that sounds just like the Jacob we know, right? So, which will lead then Jacob, and this is going ahead in the story, but when you get to 32, like we will today, in verse 32:9. Then Jacob said, O God of my father Abraham, and Elohim of my father Isaac. He even kind of distances himself there. But notice what he says, the Yahweh who said to me, return to your country and to your kindred, and I will deal well with you. I am not worthy. In other words, by the time you get to 32:9, we'll see this. He seems to accept the end result of the deal he made with Yahweh. And he says in almost reformed, I'm a depraved worm kind of language. He says, I am yours. You have kept your end of the bargain. I will now keep your end of the bargain. And then he has this wrestling match. So that to me is a fascinating story, and we'll get there. Anything else before I jump in? Chapter 31?
No,
good to go?
I think it's good to go.
All right, 31:3. Then the Lord said to Jacob, return to the land of your fathers. He's living up in Haran. And to your kindred, and I will be with you. I will be. Again, that's the same Hebrew form, the exact same Hebrew form as in Exodus 3:14 when God says, or Moses says, what is your name? Or who do I tell Pharaoh? I am who I am. That's the same form there, I will be. So you could even write in Exodus 3:14, I will be whom I will be, as the statement Yahweh says back to him. So it's not a name as much as a statement of what he's like. Anyway, so Jacob sent and called Rachel and Leah to the field, to the flock, and said, I see your father's countenance, not favorable toward me, but the Elohim of my father has been with me. Again, I notice a distance there with the claim of Yahweh as his own. I'm going to drop down to verse 11 for time. Then, this is again Jacob telling the story after complaining about Laban. Then, and let me be real careful here, the malach of the Elohim spoke to me. Again, I don't believe in the word angel. It's a bad word. So let's call it what it is. Then the malach of the Elohim spoke to me in a dream. I think he's referring back to the 28 story, the latter story, saying, Jacob. And I said, here I am. And he, the malach of the Elohim, said, lift your eyes now and see all the rams which leap on the flocks are streaked, speckled, and gray-spotted, for I have seen all that Laban is doing to you. I am the Elohim of Bethel, where you anointed the pillar and made a vow to me. So fascinating, do we not have here, in verse 11, the malach says, hello, Jacob. Then in 13, I am the Elohim of Bethel. So is this a malach or is this the Elohim of Bethel? In my opinion, this is again just me, this is where the malach is standing in for the one who has sent him, talking in first-person terms. But I can see why someone would say, this is not Yahweh, and it is Yahweh. Yahweh is talking through another being, a hypostasis, who's standing in front of him. I can see where that comes in because it's right here. Mm-hmm. Now arise, get out of this land, return to the land of your kindred. So at least our antennae are up again as good readers of the text here, that we've got the which Elohim question, the which malach question, right in front of us. And we would do good to take the capital G off God here and think through which Elohim is talking. So, ready to move on, or want to comment there?
I would want to point out that the text in verse 11, it does appear that the word Elohim, it does have the article itself. So it's the Elohim.
Yep.
And so
the malach of the Elohim. Yeah.
Or the malach of the Elohim. Malach ha Elohim, at least when I'm looking at the Hebrew on verse 11.
Malach has an article too, I believe, right? I marked it down that it's there.
No, there is no article.
Okay. I trust you, and I must have made a mistake in my own.
It's actually because it's in the construct, and so. By default, because the absolute has the article.
You're right. There is no. I'm sorry. Yep. Oh, that's where the rule of if there's an article on on the noun, then the noun in construct doesn't need it. So yeah, you're right. So ha Elohim. Notice again, we've been through this, but ha Yahweh never appears in the text. So you can't have as a textual or as a phrase in the Bible ha malach ha Yahweh. It doesn't allow it because you can't put the word ha or the article on a proper name.
Yep.
So even if you want to say the sword of David, it's not going to read, I'm just using English now, the sword, the David. It's going to just have sword David. And you're going to have to figure out based on context whether that's any sword or the sword. And so the word the is supplied by the English based on that kind of rule. But Elohim, notice, is not a name. How do we know? Because we have a article in front of it. So thank you. So 11 goes, then malach of the Elohim. So that's why we take the word the and we put it back onto malach. It's a messenger of the Elohim. And it's probably the one that he's referred to back in verse 5.
Yeah.
The God of my father. So.
And I think this is partly, again, with the two powers idea, that the second power, where in verse 13, yes, he could be speaking on behalf and sort of being a representative, but at the same time, I'm sure the Jewish readers, as they're reading this or they're listening to this, they hear the article connected to Elohim, and then in verse 13 pops up, I am the Elohim of Bethel. And I'm trying to look at verse 13. 13, where it says Elohim.
I'm pretty sure it's there.
Oh, it's actually El.
I am, yeah, the
Anaki.
El, yeah.
Anaki El Ha El. So it gets even more specific. Interesting.
Yeah, and there's the article in front of it. Yeah, the El of Bethel. I am the El of Bethel is how I see it there.
I mean, it just kind of reminds everyone in the end, like you have to go back to the original language.
Yeah. I have a Sunday school class, I think I mentioned this, that we're kind of paralleling this. So we have, it's like 25 people in a room. We sit in a big circle and we talk through, happens to be Genesis. And a couple of weeks ago, we were in Genesis 31 or somewhere in here. And I've taught the people, again, none of them speak Hebrew and I use it, but I don't speak it. But I've clued them off as to how it works in the text. And it's been fun to watch laymen and laywomen just enjoy reading Genesis, looking for and asking at least the question, which Elohim is this? Because they'll come up with ideas that maybe kind of off the wall, but at least they're thinking about it. And they're saying, I wonder if this Elohim is the same as that one over there. And it's been fun to watch laymen who, once you get clued into how to look for it, it's really quite an enjoyable and I think very profitable way to read, because this is how they would have read their own text. So got to keep moving, but thank you. Jacob has made, here's the point of the story. Jacob, in coming down to Canaan, he's been sent by God to go back. By the way, he probably knows he's going to have to talk to Esau, because Esau is living in Seir, which is a border territory to Canaan. So he kind of has in the back of his mind, I'm probably going to have to see my brother that the last time he talked to me, he said, I'm going to kill you. And that's not good. He's wondering how that relationship's going. But on that trip back, he has made the comment, and he said it in front of his wives and such, I believe, that I have been treated very well by the God of my father and the God of my grandfather. And I take it to mean that the conversations around the campfire at night were watching, I would call the true conversion or the true loyalty moment. That if I have a moment of Jacob's, you don't want to call it salvation or something like that, but where can we solidify Jacob's loyalty to Yahweh as opposed to any other deity? To me, it's the first half of 31. And then when you get to 32, he will, again, well, maybe it's 32 I'm talking about now. Yeah, I guess I would call it 32, because before he wrestles with this being, if not just before he wrestles with the being, he has declared 32:9, O God of my father Abraham, the God of my father Isaac, I am not worthy. Deliver me, I pray, for you said. So to me, this, again, I wouldn't call it conversion, but the decision to become loyal, lifelong loyalist to Yahweh is made by the moment just before the wrestling match, which I think is going to be important to my context. But to finish 31, there's some fascinating stuff going on here. Look at 14. Then Rachel and Leah answered and said to him, is there still any portion or inheritance for us in our father's house? Back in this day, and you can read this in the Cultural Study Bible, household teraphim or household idols were often a way of a girl to keep track of her inheritance. It was a stake in her father's household inheritance to have a teraphim or a handheld idol that would signify that. And so when you get down to 19, now Laban had gone to shear his sheep, and Rachel had stolen the household idols, the teraphim, that were her father's. So Laban, is Laban a Yahwist? I've often wondered that. I asked ChatGPT.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed chatting with ChatGPT about theology. More often than not, I spend my commute to work in the morning and coming home talking to ChatGPT, because there's a talk, version to it, about theology and historical, discussions of theology. And I asked it, was Laban, this is the AI version of Google, or who owns ChatGPT? I forget.
It's not Google. Google's competing against them.
Yeah. And
Apple signed an agreement with them.
Laban, here was my question to chat. Was Laban, Genesis 24:29, a worshiper of Yahweh? Here's what ChatGPT spat out in a matter of 10 seconds. So what's amazing about this. Laban, the brother of Rebekah, does not appear to have been a direct worshiper of Yahweh in the same way as Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The narrative in Genesis portrays Laban as part of a broader Mesopotamian culture that worshipped a variety of deities. Interesting. While Laban shows hospitality to Abraham's servant, Genesis 24, that was the question I was going to ask it if it didn't bring it up. He does talk as though Yahweh is to be trusted in Genesis 24. The text doesn't clearly present him as a worshiper of Yahweh. Later in Genesis 31, that's where we are, Laban is depicted as having teraphim, household gods, which suggests that he may have been a polytheist or involved in some syncretistic worship. In the Bible, it's common for people outside of the Abrahamic covenant family to recognize or interact with Yahweh without being devoted worshipers. That's very well said, and I'm glad Chat thought that up. Laban's acknowledgement of Yahweh in Genesis 24 could reflect respect or cultural norms rather than genuine worship. So I agree, based on Chat, not based on Chat, but just thinking what Chat was saying here, that the which Elohim question is not only in front of us, it's the which one does he worship question. And Laban is kind of this mysterious, I'm not sure, figure. He's got teraphim, he's got household gods, and his daughter, Rachel, has now stolen them, probably in some desire to keep her inheritance intact. So 20, Jacob stole away unknown to Laban the Syrian in that he did not tell him that he intended to flee. Verse 24, but God, there's no article there, so here's the story. But Elohim had come to Laban the Syrian. Now, that may be, in other words, we don't know which God it is based on the text. It just says, but an Elohim came to Laban the Syrian in a dream and said to him, be careful that you speak to Jacob neither good nor bad. So now Laban, a pretty middle-of-the-road Yahwist, gets a dream from an Elohim who tells him to leave Jacob alone. Drop down to 29. Well, 27. Why did you flee away? Now Laban comes up to Jacob and starts talking to him. Why did you flee away secretly and steal away from me and not tell me? For I might have sent you away with joy and songs and timbrel and harp. And you did not allow me to kiss my sons, my daughters. Now you have done foolishly in so doing. Interesting next verse. It is in my power to do you harm, but the Elohim of your father. So he does give credit for the dream of verse 24 to the Elohim of Isaac. He says, the God of your father spoke to me last night saying, be careful that you speak to Jacob neither good nor bad. Again, why didn't he say your God? He says the God of your father. Maybe he knows that Jacob's kind of wishy-washy on the which Elohim question as well. And now, and by the way, this is where my class caught this. We were just reading through this and someone quickly jumped at this, that why does he say the God of your father as though he could have said your God? Anyway, verse 30, and I love, this is a classic point here. And now you have surely gone because you greatly long for your father's house. But why did you have to steal my gods? I love that. I mean, you can take my daughters, my kids, my stuff, but why'd you have to steal my gods? I mean, come on. And that does make me wonder, again, is Laban a Yahwist, or is he just one of these Mesopotamian dudes who he might be a Yahwist, but he still has, the effects of Mesopotamian polytheism in his background so deeply that, yeah, he does have these gods. Here's a good example, by the way, Mike, of and this is one of several, where God's Elohim is flipped back and forth between an idol. So the idol is the God is the idol. Although they knew the difference. The people in the story knew the difference. But in literary form, you could say either one. And they knew that one was the other. So gods or teraphim are really the same items. Anything else? Otherwise, I'm ready to keep rambling here.
I would say it is interesting. I didn't bring this up before when we first encountered Laban. I'm trying to remember back in the episode where Rebecca was, like the servant of Abraham came and found Rebecca and such, and tells the story about how Abraham's looking for a wife for his son, Isaac. And I didn't get a chance to mention it, but I have been wondering if there was like hints being telegraphed even as far as early as Genesis 24 and 25 about Laban, that he's a man of the world. He's a man of the culture. And it seemed when I was reading it that he noticed little things such as like, oh, the servant of Abraham, this guy seems loaded. And that he's able to bring a very nice dowry for Rebecca. And so it seems that he isn't necessarily, I think, a man who is vehemently against Yahweh, but I think he is a person that is looking for whatever angle, whatever advantage he can get in this very harsh world that he is living in. Yeah. And so like for him to say, like, why did you steal my gods? It sounds strange to us. And then we immediately wonder, like, is he a loyalist? Is he not a loyalist? But I wonder if his response would be, I am just simply looking out for actual number one. Yeah, I'm looking out for myself. and if I need to appeal to other divine beings or supernatural beings to get ahead of life or just survive, I'll do that. What's wrong with that? And
we don't have the Shema yet. I mean, let's put these people where they are. They don't have Exodus 20, verse 1, thou shalt have no other gods before me. That, in fact, that's a good point, that the reason we get the first command is because of this kind of story, that even Jacob doesn't maybe know that you can't have multiple. And that's why he's making this deal with Yahweh back in 28. If you do this and this and this, you can be my Elohim. We can't do that now because of the Shema. We're not allowed theologically to make deals like that. David would never be heard saying that, right? Mm-hmm. So, but reading the story left to right, I'm not going to hold Jacob too accountable based on what he would have known at the time. So, yeah. Well, we all know how the story kind of goes. 31. Then Jacob answered and said to Laban, well, because I was afraid, and I said, perhaps you would take your daughters by force. That's why I took your gods. With whomever you find your gods, though, let him not live. In other words, Jacob didn't know that Rachel had stolen them.
Yeah.
34, Rachel had taken the household idols, put them under the camel's saddle, and sat on them. And so when they went searching, they didn't find them, and she gave herself an excuse for not getting off the horse. And 36, Jacob was angry and rebuked Laban and said, what is my sin? What's my trespass? Why are you so hotly pursuing me? Basically lets Laban have it. 39 is interesting, by the way. That which was torn by beasts I did not bring to you. I bore the loss of it. The word loss there is kata, the word we call sin. But again, kata is bigger than sin in the Bible. So when we see the word sin in our Bibles, that's an English idea. In Hebrew, the word loss here even counts as kata, which again, it's much broader concept than our English concept of sin. But I like 42. Verse 42, unless the Elohim of my father, the Elohim of Abraham, and the fear, the word fear there is a actual word to shudder, to be afraid. Yeah. The fear of Isaac had been with me. Surely now you would have sent me away empty-handed. So he basically is saying in a roundabout way to his father-in-law, I've got Yahweh on my side. Not that I've made my mistakes, I have, but I have him on my side, and he's the one who has seen my affliction, to end verse 42, and the labor of my hands, and rebuked you last night. He credits Yahweh for that, whether again it was sent by Elohim, an agent or not, it doesn't matter. It's Yahweh is the one who did that dream, and you are being told by my God that he's about to make his own Yahweh, or his own Elohim, his own for good. So that's all I want to say about 50 or 31, except I will also see, interesting, 49. He says, may Yahweh watch between you and me when we are absent. That's not a Christmas card. That's a look out below. I'm seeking my God after you, Laban. Well, actually, this is Laban talking to Jacob and maybe using his God against him. Whether or not Laban was a Yahwist or not, again, it's open question. So
sure. One thing I will say though about this moment, because Rachel did steal the teraphim, the little household gods, idols. There is a bit of me that cringes and wonders when Jacob says that, whoever, if whoever stole it, if it is found, like that, he didn't know that Rachel had him.
It's scary.
Yeah. And this is a telegraph. If people have never read through all of Genesis, like Rachel doesn't live very much longer. Right. Like
you're right. Yeah.
And that, Leah has a lot of kids, the concubines have a lot of kids, but Rachel is not able to conceive as many, and she only has at most 2 sons. Right. Which is partly, that leads into the drama about Joseph and leads into the fear about Benjamin and everything towards the end of Genesis. But it's because they were the children of Rachel. And the one that Jacob actually truly loved. And yet he says, like, it almost to me is like, this is a reminder of like, be careful with your words.
Could be.
Because it's never said directly. It's never implied. It's never said like, oh, this is, unfortunately she died because of this, but it's this weird, like, oh, like you just cringe a bit if you know what's coming ahead of like, oh dear, why did you say that, Jacob?
Yeah.
So
interesting. The one other thing I'll say then too, as we close up 31, as Laban talks to Jacob one more time in verse 53, the Elohim of Abraham, the Elohim of Nahor, and the Elohim of their father judge, and that's plural. The verb is plural. So he may be speaking, at least in verbal form here, of 3 different deities. May the God of Abraham, the Elohim of Nahor, and the Elohim of their father, all 3 of them judge between us. Whether that's the same, interesting possibility. That's where you have to watch for the verbs and not just the nouns.
Well, it's also kind of weirdly, it almost seems like it's an early version of what would eventually become the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But right, we're at Jacob right now. So what past 3 can we go beyond Jacob? And it is interesting that at the end of 53, Jacob swore by the fear of his father Isaac. Like that, it goes back to that episode about the whole entire moment when Isaac was being sacrificed, that this title that Isaac associated with Yahweh seems to be, he's the fear.
And maybe, there it is. Maybe that swearing by would be, if we want to nail down a turning point in Jacob's loyalty to Yahweh. Now my new theory would be 31:53, because of, again, the prayer of 32:9 coming up sounds like a loyalist to me. Yeah. And then I'm going to argue that the wrestling match is because of loyalty. So actually, I'm making a judgment on the fly here, but I like 31:53 for his, his putting a stake in the ground, saying, I'm done playing Elohim here off each other. I'm going to go with one and not another. Well, in fact, the next verse, then Jacob offered a sacrifice on the mountain and called his brethren to eat bread. There's a kind of a communal sacrifice made for what purpose? Maybe it was because he has decided where his loyalties are going to lie. That gets me ready for 32. Go ahead.
Could this possibly be a moment, like it doesn't say so in the text, but there's a meal.
Yeah,
there's a sacrifice, there's a meal. Covenants are usually closed off with a meal.
Well, the Lord's table, 1 Corinthians 10 and 11, same thing. You've got this meal being shared. And why was it being shared? There's a communion with demons or Jesus. You got a choice here. So, it's often in the picture of worship, which deity you worship. So, good point. Something to study on our own later. All right, but 32. Here's that famous chapter. I love verse 1 and 2, again, and 3. Jacob in 32:1. So Jacob went on his way, and Malachim of Elohim met him. No articles there. Malachim of Elohim. You could say divine messengers.
Sure. You can go with that.
Then Jacob, now that, again, here's one of those moments where what? Divine messengers, what's that? Could they be UPS drivers who are simply unemployed for the day? I mean, could they be humans? I mean, at least you have to ask the question, because to be a malachim of Yahweh or of an Elohim may be that you're a messenger. Notice I'm not saying angel. You are a messenger of a divine being, but you're a human too. So that's possible. But let's at least let the text tell us what happens. And in verse 2, we do know. Then Jacob saw them, and he said, "This is God's camp." So 32:2. I'm going to pull up the Hebrew again just to make sure I'm reading what I think I remember seeing. This is God's camp. Machane.
Yeah.
Machane Elohim. A camp of gods, or God, Elohim. Mm-hmm. My guess is plural there. Do we have any proof that it would be not capital G-O-D-S, apostrophe S, but small G-O-D-S's? This is a camp of gods. I would say exactly that's the point, because of how 1 starts. Here's how I think 1 and 2 mean, or what they mean. He's moving now. He comes upon this group of divine messengers, and he says, we're going to call this Elohim camp. Proof again that Malachim are Elohim. And that if a person says, well, I believe in angels, but I don't believe in gods, you've got this passage to work through. Because he looks at Malachim, who are Elohim, they're being sent by an Elohim, and then he immediately calls it a camp of Elohim. So, Again, I'm recommending, and I know you're on board. I know Mike was on board with this too. Get angel out of your vocabulary. It just despoils the whole story if you say, well, those are angels. No, they're not. These are gods. These are created divine beings who are here for a reason, and it makes you wonder why they're there. I mean, this is telegraphing, clearly telegraphing a important story to come. And anyway, it's all in 1 and 2, but it's fascinating how that works. Any thoughts there?
No, I think if people are disturbed by even just the using the word gods, then supernatural beings, divine beings, they're not human. Yeah. I know people do get tricked or ticked off at the word gods, and you're right. If you want to call them divine beings, go ahead, but don't call them angels, because we know that angels in medieval thinking are less than deity or less than gods. And I'm trying to make the point that textually they are Elohim, and the text does not allow us to go any other way. Mm-hmm. I love verse 3 for this reason. Jacob sent Malachim before him to Esau. Now the word is used. Malachim is used, and you can tell by the context it's a physical person, because Esau, unless he's taking some of those Elohim in verse 1 and sending those Elohim, divine beings, to Esau. That's possible, but all of our Bibles, I looked this one up throughout these the most popular Bibles, all the Bibles that we have that we're looking at will go with messengers there. Then Jacob sent messengers before him to Esau. And the story from verses 4 and on does include human beings. So it's a good example of how Malachim in 32:1 is translated angels in most of our Bibles, and then it's translated as messengers in verse 3, but it's the same word, Malachim. So why does your Bible put angels in 1 and messengers in 3? Because they made the mistake of thinking, that they can tell you that angels are a category of existence based on the use of an English word. So, Ron, if
once again before me,
my hot take would be just, again, like what we talked about in the last episode, right? That the difference between the physical and the unseen realm in the ancient Near Eastern mind or Israelite mind, it was very porous, right? And so even in how the translation's done, how it's rendered, it tries to create this very hard line dichotomy of like physical, spiritual. And so thus we see the word messengers. In one, we say those are angels. And then in another one, we immediately say they're just messengers, implying they're human, they're physical.
Yeah.
And yet there's nothing here that would say to me, like, well, how in the world did Jacob see the angels of God? They manifested in some sort of physical form.
Right.
So what prevents him from asking, hey, can you do me a solid?
Yep, yeah. I do think it's possible that verse 3 is talking about the very same messengers as verse 1. That's very possible. They show up in verse 6 again, too. We can jump there. Then the Malachim returned to Jacob, saying, we came to your brother Esau. So the beings he sends on a mission come back to him, saying, Esau's got 400 guys. Is it 400? It's a huge
400
group.
men.
Yeah. 400 people are coming. So anyway, long story short, we can move on. But the story of Jacob is he's about to meet his brother Esau, which back in 27, the last words he heard from him was, I'm going to kill you. And so now he's very afraid. Esau has in the meantime become very wealthy. And these messengers come back to Jacob saying, I know you're heading we're heading down toward Seir to move into the land of Canaan. Your brother is, we found him. And he is coming to meet you. 400 men are with him, verse 6. So Jacob, verse 7, is obviously greatly afraid and distressed. He divided the people that were with him. And he says, verse 8, if Esau comes to the one company and attacks it, then the other company which is left will escape. So he goes through some elaborate planning here to put various stages of people and stuff and Leah in front of Rachel, that kind of thing, just so that he can defend himself and his most loved ones from his brother.
Yeah.
We mentioned verse 9, how this is one of the few prayers of Genesis. You don't commonly hear someone, or at least the words of a prayer, right? And I'm sure they prayed, but this is the recitation of a prayer that he makes. And it's very, again, a DCW would just jump on this to figure out where Jacob's heart was when it came to Yahweh. O Elohim of my father Abraham and Elohim of my father Isaac, the Yahweh who said to me, return to your country and to your kindred, and I will deal well with you. There's that deal he made with him back in 31. I am not worthy of the least of all the mercies and of all the truth. Truth often, emet in Hebrew, has the concept of promise keeping. I'm a true God. I keep what I say. Of all the truth which you have shown to your servant, for I crossed over this Jordan with my staff. And now I have become two companies. Deliver me, I pray, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau. For I fear him, lest he come and attack me. For you said, and he's referring back to, again, probably 28, I will surely treat you well, make your descendants as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered. So he holds him to his promise. Jacob holds Yahweh to the promise that he made. I don't think Yahweh's offended by that. I think Yahweh loves it when, and David does this in the Psalms a lot, when we hold Yahweh, shall we say, accountable to what he said, because Yahweh loves to show. I mean, I would be honored by my children if they played me off myself and said, Dad, and would come to me and say, Dad, you said. And I see in their eyes a desire for me to be honest to what I said, even if it was a promise, an outlandish promise to them. Kids are good at this, right? Remembering what Dad promised. That's an honorable thing to be challenged by your children, whom you love, to hear them say back to you, you promised. And I'd recommend, here's one of those first ones in our text, and it's a delightful response or illustration of Jacob's monotheism now, shall we say, that got its start not probably very long before this. As we move on, I'm not going to read through all the story, because from 12 through 21, it's basically the story of Jacob, sounding just like Jacob again, figuring out how to amass his property, his people, his loved ones, and so forth in such an order that if Esau is military minded at all, if he starts attacking one group, he'll be able to flee out the back end. So it's just a long rendition of how he's going to go about this. For time, we're not going to read it. Yep. I'm ready for 22.
Yep.
And he arose that night and took his, now again, think of where we are. We are coming down into the land of Canaan. He arose that night and took his 2 wives, his 2 maidservants, and his 11 sons, and crossed over the ford of the Jabbok, or Yabok. Now, the Jabbok is, and you can look this up in good Bible dictionaries and things, and I'd recommend you do. From what I'm seeing, and just from what I've read, the Jabbok is the later, Joshua 12:2, the boundary of the Ammonite and the Amorite civilizations. One commentator, in fact, this is the NISB study notes, it's the frontier of Israelite territory, the Jabbok. If you're looking on a map, coming down on the Transjordan, the eastern side of the Jordan River, between Galilee and Dead Sea, almost equidistant, is this main tributary that goes into the Jordan River, again traveling east to west, and it's a very steep valley. And so it set itself up in the ancient world. And again, we don't have city-states here in our story, but it set itself up in later stories of the Bible to be a very clear boundary between city-states or territories. And so my recommendation is that you are given, in fact, it's the border of Sihon's kingdom and Og's kingdom later in the book of Numbers. So the point is, I think what the writer would be telegraphing to the reader when it says he crossed over the ford of Jabbok is that he's walking over a boundary. He's crossing a boundary. And as the NISB Study Bible notes, it's what they call the frontier, the outpost of Israelite territory. If that's true, my antenna really go up. Because think of where we are in the story. He's come to this camp of divine beings. What are they doing there? We don't know. He meets them and he says, that's cool. This is a Elohim camp. They're having s'mores and,
angel
campfire.
cake.
Yeah, angel cake. There we go. And in other words, 1 and 2 are said in such an offhanded way. Could it be that 22 is going back to that point that they are there because this is a very important portion of worldwide territory when it comes to borders? Now, again, if you've been with us in this podcast, you know what a border means in ancient cosmology. When God divided the world in Genesis 11, he did it through divine beings, and they are the ones who are on these borders, or they would be concerned with border territory. So my guess is this, and I'm going to paraphrase it, but 22 would sound like this. He arose that night, took his 2 wives, and he crossed a border that was very, very important to the story. He took them, sent them over, verse 23, sent over what he had against a lot of work because it's a very steep valley. I'm reading now 24. Then Jacob was left alone. This is dark. And a man, I believe it's Ish. I know it is either Adam or Ish. I forget which one it is. Quick look. I don't want to
Ish.
imply that it's not important. It's an Ish.
Yep.
So, in other words, the text is very, very clear. This is a man. This is a human. From everything we know, he's a human so far in the story. Now, my Bible capitalizes the M. I think that's getting ahead of ourselves. Leave it as a man. That's all the text wants you to know. A man wrestled with him until the breaking of day. Now, the word wrestle, I believe, is very rare. I'm going to check it really quick. I remember making this note to myself. Guess what? It's only here. Yeah, only in this story. Repeated in verse 25. The word wrestle is just to wrestle. My recommendation is that this is not a prayer time. This is not having a devotions with somebody. This is not wrestling in prayer. In other words, that's completely invented. This is a wrestling match to the death. This is a man who wants to take Jacob's head off. And the word to use is wrestle. Okay. And in other words, it's not a happy thing. Now, when the man saw that he, verse 25, that he did not prevail against him, Jacob, he, the man, touched the socket of Jacob's hip. And the word touch there it has a range of meaning, all from touching to smiting. So my guess is he whacked it, a good whack. Mm-hmm. And the socket of Jacob's hip was out of joint as he wrestled with him. So again, this is not a happy time. This isn't playful. This is to the death, my guess would be. And he, that's the man, verse 26, said, let me go, for the day breaks. Now there is, again, you read commentaries on this, the tradition of demons of the night that don't want to be seen in daylight. That's a very old tradition. It's not necessarily having to be read into this. So I don't really deal with that in my own thinking. All I know is what I'm told in the story, and that's this. These two guys are going at it, and Jacob is whacked at one point, and he is really hurting. But the other one says to Jacob, let me go. I can't keep going on. But he, Jacob, said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. Now, what in the world is Barak? That's a very common term. Hebrews 7:7. It's always, in other words, it's a cultural norm that the superior blesses the inferior. And the idea that to ask a blessing from a divine being is very common, or to ask a blessing of a divine being is almost normal. I wrote down, bless me. 17 times prior to this, it's used in Genesis, the phrase bless, or the word bless. Each time it's Yahweh blessing somebody. So we are now the 18th use of bless, and everyone before this was Yahweh blessing somebody. Now the 18th use, it's Jacob asking a blessing from this being. So now that doesn't prove anything, but it's interesting again that it's the same word. It's not, again, anything deeper than that. So he, verse 27, that's the man, said to Jacob, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. Again, in the ancient world, to know someone's name apparently was a sign of superiority, or at least you could use their name and so forth and so on. My father-in-law is he's retired Navy, and I asked him about this once, just on a whim, based on this story in the back of my head. But, do you ever ask a superior their name? And he kind of jumped at, like, why would I do that? In other words, he was so, Navy-minded. You always salute the person that deserves it. To ask them their name would have been out of bounds in his mind. It's interesting that even today that's felt compared to back here. What is your name? So he's asking the inferior, I want your name, and the inferior, I think, gives it to him. It's Jacob. And he said, that's the man, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel. Now, I have a study note there, peace with God, or prince with God. The etymology of Israel is difficult. Most think it's something like El rules. Do you have any study notes near your text today?
I'm looking at Golden Gaze commentary. God will rule, or may God rule.
Yeah, El rules. So we're not sure, but El, of course, is the word for divine being, and often used of Yahweh at this point. In fact, if you go back to it's ahead to 33:20. He, that's Jacob, erects an altar there and called it El Elohe Israel. El is the God of Israel. So if he's calling Yahweh El, then if you go back to 32:28, here's, again, I'm theorizing. He said that the man said to Jacob, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but El rules. The God you worship rules. For you have struggled with, and here we go. Here's the difference. Christian Bibles almost, I don't think I found one. Without exception, they all put a capital G on God there. For you have struggled with God and with men and have prevailed. Can you guess what my Sunday school class, without saying a word, these 25 people in the room, when we read through this, somebody put up their hand and said, what? Can you guess? That doesn't say God. That says divine being, doesn't it? In other words, what's being said here, and I said, when that's where I had my Jewish Bible with me, and I said, wouldn't you know, here's how the Jewish Publication Society reads. I'm going to pull it up here. Your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with beings divine and human, and have prevailed. So, yeah, the Jewish Study Bible, which again I lean on them because they usually know their grammar better than Gentiles. They have a small g there, or divine being. For you have struggled with beings divine and human, and have prevailed. Then Jacob asked him, saying, tell me your name, going up in rank. Because remember, he asked for a blessing from that being, which would be going up in rank. Now he wants to know the name of that being going up in rank, and the being says, can't do it. Why is you at? I mean, why would you do that? That is not proper. And he blessed him there, took leave of him, which can mean to bless him there. So that's the story. Notice Jacob then what he does. He calls the name of the place Peniel. Panim is the Hebrew word for face.
Yes, the face.
And El, of course, divine being. The face of a divine being. And notice again how it would go. In our English Bible, for I have seen God face to face, capital G. In the Jewish Study Bible, he named it Peniel, saying, I have met a divine being face to face. Yet my life has been preserved. So the sun rose upon him as he passed, limping on his hip. Well, Ron, you can see where I'm going with this. I think that the man he wrestled with was not Yahweh. In fact, he wasn't even a nice Elohim. I think he was he was a being who was, based on Genesis 11, positioned to defend territory. And this camp of Elohim that's apparently nearby is also another group that kind of like you're in your Civil War reenactment. You've got a camp over here, and you've got a guy over here, and a camp over here. That this is a story of cosmic geography. And so when Jacob finds himself in a struggling match, the mistake he makes, see, in other words, this is not a good story. He's not having a prayer time with God. He's asking a blessing from a divine being who is not Yahweh. In other words, it was a mistake. And the defense I would have for this would be Hosea 12, where the story is told again. And with this we end. Our time is getting close. But listen to Hebrews 12. Again, I'll read it out of the Jewish Study Bible. Ephraim tends the wind. Hosea 12, 1-7. Ephraim tends the wind and pursues the gale. In other words, the northern 10 tribes, you guys are like the wind. Remember, he's complaining about their lack of loyalty. Mm-hmm. He is forever adding illusion to calamity. Now they, again, the northern tribes, make a covenant with Assyria. Now oil is carried to Egypt. There's another example of being loyal to other gods in other countries. Then, interesting story. Yahweh once indicted Judah and punished Jacob for his conduct, requited him for his deeds. How so? In the womb, he tried to supplant his brother. Now, that's a story from 27. Mm-hmm. Grown to manhood, he strove with a Elohim, divine being, in the Jewish Study Bible. He strove with a divine being. He strove with a malach and prevailed. The other had to weep and implore him. At Bethel, in other words, that's where he made his mistake. The Lord indicted Judah and punished Jacob for his deeds, plural. 1, grabbing his brother's heel. 2, striving with this divine being and asking for a blessing. Then he ends by saying, and this is again Hosea 12, at Bethel, he would meet him there to commune with us. It's apparently Yahweh. And then notice, this is probably referring to the divine beings from Genesis 35. But here's the important verse again that the Jewish Study Bible differs from English. Yet Yahweh, the God of hosts, must be invoked as Yahweh. You must return to your Elohim. Practice goodness and justice and constantly trust in your Elohim. So the yet Yahweh, the God of hosts, must be invoked. In English versions, like in my New King James, That is the Lord God of hosts. Yahweh is his memorial. In other words, this idea of who did Jacob wrestle with in our English Bibles, not only in Genesis 32, but in Hosea 12, we have put God in there. So again, now I'm opening my New King James to Hosea 12, and it reads this way, verse 3. He took his brother by the heel in the womb, and in his strength he struggled with God, capital G. Yes, he struggled with the angel, capital A, and prevailed. So I just think our Christian Bibles really, do some gymnastics to turn this into a prayer time with Yahweh. And the Jewish Study Bible a long time ago said, no, this is Jacob doing what Hosea 12 said he should not do, and that is ask a blessing from a being who was protecting territory from him. So that's my call anyway. What do you think?
I'm not entirely convinced. I think there is something also going on where you have Genesis 48, where you have Jacob referring back to all these encounters with the Elohim, but with ultimately the God of his father. And so what I do find interesting, right, is that the word but or so can also be and, right?
Right.
It depends on how you render it and how the grammar works out. And also I would push back, like the fact that in Hosea there's a reference to angel or a reference to malak. And then when you look at how Jacob recounts his encounters with divine beings or with Yahweh to Joseph as he's blessing Joseph's two sons.
Yeah, you're in 48:15.
Yeah, 48:15-16. He mentions a malak. And so, when you're looking back at what we have of the record of Jacob, well, where is the malak besides, the camp of the malaks?
Right. The malak who redeemed me from all evil. This is 48:16.
Yeah. And so that's where I would differ with you, Ron, about this, because one, like, I guess the way that I'm looking at this story, right, is that, like you mentioned earlier, towards the end of 31, Jacob is scheming again. He's trying to figure out how to, at least if all of his camp cannot survive, can at least half his camp survive? He's being Jacob. He's scheming. And at the end, I take it that the man that he met was the second power, or at least a hint of Yahweh as the second power. And what's funny, and Golden Gate even points it out, that whole entire thing with the hip, it's not just a touch or a smiting. It's a classic cheating move of wrestlers to essentially punch someone in the groin as you're in the midst of the struggle.
You could translate that as groin, yeah.
Yeah, and that the deceiver, the trickster, basically gets one up by a being who is even trickier than him. And so it, to me, it almost seems like when we get to Genesis 48 and he's talking about the malak who redeemed me, it almost seems like this is how I'm imagining it in the scenario. That if this malak is actually at least a loyalist to Yahweh, maybe not Yahweh himself, but at least a loyalist, then what's going on here is that Jacob, Yahweh saw your scheming again. You declared loyalty, but now you're doing all this kind of back work.
Okay.
He can out-trick you. Yahweh can out-trick you. And so thus you have to submit. And so that's why we get into that episode of like, what is your name? Because here's and this is maybe my cards laying out on the table, is that I am uncomfortable with the concept that if this malak, this divine being, was a rival to Yahweh, an evil being, then the implication is that Israel, the whole, the person himself, and later on his descendants, were named by a non-loyalist.
I would say no, and watch what I would do to argue against that. Go up to 35. Well, let's compare 32, 28. He doesn't call him Israel. He says your name will be called Israel. Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel. So in other words, he's predicting something. And then in 35:9, Then Elohim appeared to Jacob again when he came from Paddan Aram and blessed him. And Elohim, and I take this to be Yahweh, said to him, your name is Jacob. Your name shall not be called Jacob, but anymore. Okay, now we're making the actual official switch. But Israel shall be your name. So, and he called his name Israel. So I would say 35:10 is Yahweh naming Jacob Israel. 28:20, whatever, was the prediction of the divine being that he would get the name. Makes sense?
But at the same time, though, then it brings up into what does Jacob mean about the Malak who redeemed me, right? And I think that's because the only instance that we could think of then where a Malak appears is this incident. And so what does the redeeming mean? And that's, that's partly where I'm hesitant.
31:11 had Jacob meeting a Malak.
Yeah.
And talking to him. So could that be the Redeemer? You're going to have in Exodus 4, Moses having a fight over circumcision, and he's almost killed by God. And I take that to be a nefarious being that God allows to beat up on Moses. As long as we have our options open to the hearer, that's what we're both trying to do, is say, well, wait a second. How could, and let me state your position to your liking before I disagree with it. How could Israel get the name Israel from a nefarious divine being? My answer, again, both is that he predicted that God would change it. And number two, it's just like the word Christian in Acts 13. It wasn't given to us by God. It was given to us by Antiochian people who didn't like Christians. In other words, it's a name given to us by our enemy, and we hold it proudly. 1 Peter, 4? Hold up the name Christian proudly is a way of saying, look right at your enemy who calls you one and say, yep, that's me, I'm a little Jesus. And the same with Israel, that your Elohim rules, your El rules would be, in my version of the story, this being is trying to beat up Jacob. He can't seem to do it, which is bizarre. How can a divine being not beat up on a human? That breaks rank right there. But then he blesses him, but he also says El rules, that he's admitting that El, the name of the God apparently that Jacob worshipped, is the ruler. So it would be kind of a statement of, the name Israel is a statement made of submission to a wrestling match that went the wrong way, according to this divine being. So. Well, do we have our options open? At least we're.
I think our options
clearly
are open.
As we can.
To your question of how can a human being hold up against a divine being? I don't know if you ever watch Japanese anime, Ron, but
no, I didn't.
one of the more famous ones that I used to watch in my youth was a series called Dragon Ball, and very particular in that show, they had this convention where opponents could actually size one another up with technology. They could figure out, what's your power level? But more than often than once in the series, you would have a character whose power level is significantly low. And yet, because he needs to hold this opponent at bay long enough for the stronger opponent, for the ally to come in to rescue and save the day, he would need to contend. And so it's not just pure strength or power level. Ultimately, you would see trickery. You would see delay tactics. You would literally, it's like moments of throwing dust in the eyes of the stronger opponent and essentially holding your ground, even though technically you are physically nowhere near the strength of your opponent. But through trickery, you could. And I do wonder, the question of how could Jacob wrestle with a divine being and still hold him at bay? Well, he is the trickster. He is the one that grabbed Esau's heel. He's the one that has that kind of reputation. And ultimately, what does him in is by a greater foolery of trickery, punching him in the groin. Both
of our views struggle with how could Jacob win, right?
Yeah.
Because you have him with a deity or God, a complementary figure. I have him with a antagonist. Either one goes against protocol,
Yeah.
Unless God, in your view, God would be purposely allowing Jacob to have the better, shall we say. But in my view, it would be Jacob somehow breaking protocol to the surprise of the divine being. And that's even what causes him to name him that. So,
I mean, I would say in my view is that this divine being is holding back because he's trying to teach Jacob something, right?
Okay.
And that Jacob has, like you mentioned at the end of 31, he still hasn't learned. Like he still keeps resorting back to his trickery, even though he had this moment of loyal allegiance that he gave, and yet he goes back to old ways again. And I wonder, is it possible in this story that this is like, I'm done with this trickery, Jacob. You need to learn. And thus why Jacob would later say, redeem me from all evil.
Yeah. Whatever's going on in 48, he has in mind some divine being who helped him. So now we have to go find him. Well, very good. Thank you, Mike, again for your honest pushback. I need it, and as a teacher would attest, and I'm sure you've seen this in your teachers, and I experienced it myself, that when the student doesn't push back, even if it's a group of students, if they don't push back, then you are pretty convinced you're right. Because no one said anything. So you leave the classroom thinking you're right more often than not, simply because nobody disagreed. So it's good to get it. And it reminds me again of those nights when I did, room with Mike, Dr. Heiser at ETS, and the lights were off and we're staring at the ceiling in our 2 queen beds, and we'd go at it pretty good. I mean, it was always with a laugh, basically, whether I should draft Joe Burrow from my fantasy team or how I took the snake of Genesis 3. He gave it to me both barrels, so that was just how we did it. Alrighty, well, thank you. And next time we'll keep going, 33, when Jacob and Esau actually meet, and see how that goes. So until then, have a great week, and we'll talk to you again.